In this episode of Calming the Chaos, I talk about the very important topic of abuse. It seems that abuse is all around us, and then sometimes we're not aware of it, or when it's happening to others or to ourselves. So, I'm going to cover the definition of abuse and just consider the different ways that we can be abused so we can be aware of it. We're not going to be talking about any specific situation, but just be focusing on the topic of emotional abuse. How we can notice when we're being emotionally abused, when we're emotionally abusing others, when our words just don't come out right, or when we're abusing ourselves. So I'm going to conclude too by giving you some thoughts and tips about ways that we can stand against abuse and treat others and ourselves with kindness, compassion, understanding, and love.
Hello, and welcome to Calming the Chaos, where we present tips, tools, and techniques to help you find peace in a chaotic world. I'm your host, Tracy Canella, licensed mental health counselor at Lokahi Counseling. This channel and the Calming the Chaos podcast is for those who want self-help and education. It's not a substitute for counseling or psychotherapy. So if you like the information, please subscribe to my channel and share it with your friends. Thanks so much for listening. And now, let the chaos begin.
So I'm going to be talking to you while I'm on a walk. So it's sort of a walk and talk. And so I hope you enjoy it and you take something from it. So let's get started. When I'm on my morning walks, I often think of many things. And sometimes they're deep things, sometimes they're shallow things, sometimes my mind will just wander. And one of the things I've been thinking about lately is the way we treat each other and the way we treat ourselves, not just in person with our friends and family members, but our online presence and how we treat each other. I think online it's easier to have that sense of separation from other people because we've never actually met them in person. And although we might have a relationship with them, it might be easier to be able to be chaotic around them or to sort of get involved in chaos, arguments, disputes. It's just easier. I think that if most of these online disputes and conversations happened in person, it would be really awkward for a lot of people. But that's where my mind goes when I'm wandering my walk and the path of life. And I'd like to be able to just talk a little bit about abuse, introducing the topic and the definition first. Abuse is a verb, which is an action word for the improper usage or treatment of a person, place, or thing. Often, abusive behavior is for the abusers to direct their anger or issues outward onto something else, or to unfairly or improperly gain some sort of benefit. Abuse can come in so many forms, such as physical abuse, hurting people physically, hurting people emotionally with our words or our deeds, and sometimes by not acting at all. It can be political abuse, abuses of power, chemical abuse, chemical dependency. It can come in the form of injury or assault, breaking the law, violation, unjust practices, breaking and entering, crimes, or any other sort of aggression. As I walk on the path of my own life, I see the twists and turns, but I also see the bright spots. Sometimes my mind wanders here and there, and sometimes I start to think about how we treat each other and how I would like to be treated and how I would like to treat other people who share this lovely world of ours. Just look at my walk. This is what I can see every day: the trees, the road, and the water. And if we're lucky, the sunshine. And we can hear sounds of birds or chipmunks or chainsaws or people laughing. And we can smell smells of wood stoves or the sea air. And mostly we can feel. And I really want to talk about feeling because that has a lot to do about abuse. So, when we talk about abuse, the reason that I'm bringing up this subject is because we need to be more aware of when we are abusing others and when we're abusing ourselves, but also to be aware of when we're being abused so we can stand with ourselves. You know, we're not always going to have somebody in our corner. Sometimes we might be very much alone and facing the onslaught of people's words or actions against us. And so we do need to feel strong. Sometimes it'll work, and sometimes we're just overpowered. But I do want you to know and be educated about abuse so that when you go out there in this world, it's probably not going to be as beautiful as what you're seeing right now. It's actually going to be pretty tough at times. But we can treat people, places, and things and ourselves with respect and honor and not abuse ourselves or others or our world. I'm just looking around thinking, I would never want to abuse this. I'm so grateful for this. I get to see it every day. And there are so many things in my life that I'm grateful for. I'm grateful for the community that I have been able to know through social media, through YouTube, through Facebook, through Instagram, through my colleague group. And I like to think in terms of gratitude for what we have in our world. And so, anyone who's been abused or who has been an abuser knows the chaos that can happen in the minds before, during, and after any sort of abuse. And I'm saying this because I've seen it in my counseling practice with my clients and in my own life. The effects are devastating. And maybe we'll never actually ever completely obliterate abuse. But I know that with awareness, we can all treat each other and ourselves so much better. I just want to call attention to this because it feels so awful after abuse happens to the abuser and to the victims. What we say about real people in person and online can be considered abuse. How we treat people in person and online can be considered abuse. Making speculations without concrete facts or evidence in person and online can be considered abuse. And so here's where I shift to talking about what we say online about other people and about other situations, and especially about children. Yes, we have freedom of speech. And thanks to many social media platforms, we now have very many places to go in order to air our opinions, both in writing and in video, in audio, and there's free speech. And so people get to say what they think, and they get to voice their opinions on what they know and what they believe to be true. These are our rights. Freedom of speech is a beneficial right, and we don't want to take it lightly. because there are ethics involved with what we do, and there are consequences in what we say. I know this firsthand because just only this weekend, I made a very big blunder on an online platform, which I am dearly sorry for. And I'm going to have to make repairs for that, and I will. There are ethics in aspirational values, like what we aspire to be and who we aspire to be. That's beyond the law. Ethics are what rein us in and help us to know what is going to be most helpful for ourselves and for our fellow men and women and children and beings and places and things in this world. So there's free speech and there are ethics. And you can see this on a continuum to where free speech is on one end and ethics are on the other, and it can wrap around into a circle or both connect as well. And there are very many points in between where you can find your way, you can find your voice, you can find a way to express yourself that is in keeping with your own value system. And that's what I want to talk about. So, one of the things that's on my mind is the exploitation of people. And this happens online quite a bit from what I've been seeing. Specifically, people who do not give your consent to talk about their lives on your shows. So there are some people who are victims of crimes or people who have allegations of crimes against them, whatever it is. If you don't have their consent and you talk about them anyway, this could be considered abuse. When you think about the verb of abuse, the improper usage or treatment of a person, place, or thing, then I would urge you to please be mindful with your words before you consider topics for your shows or your live stream videos, whatever it is. I would just really urge you to consider whether you have consent. Consent is such a big issue with abuse because when you do not have consent and you go ahead and do things anyway, it can be considered abuse. Another thought I had is the graphic details that sometimes come into play when we describe people who are abused or victims of crimes. And it's not necessarily presented in the most sensitive way. We want to have information about potential abuses. Absolutely. We want to learn more about how to detect abusers, how to spot abuse, and how to keep abuse from being a part of our behaviors as well. And yet, these graphic details that people sometimes provide are generally not helpful when we're trying to learn how to be more mindful about the topic of abuse. And so, if you're anti abuse, if you really stand against abuse, please, I implore you, don't do this on your channel or to your listeners who are affected by it. Unless you have the consent of the person or the person is agreeing that you can talk about it and the person is talking about it yourself and you give a warning, please be sensitive. Consider what your mission is and what your intentions are in airing any sort of videos or live streams that have to do about abuse, especially sexual abuse or physical abuse of a child, which is actually against the law and needs to be reported. My intentions are to be able to have the topic of abuse talked about openly, and yet being sensitive to anyone, any specific person who has been affected by it, unless that person wants to share their story, unless they consent to a platform. My specific view on it is that exposing the truth in public about people's lives without their consent is generally not helpful. If your end game or your goal is to stop the exploitation of children and other people, people who are minorities, people who are vulnerable, if you do not want exploitation, then please, I implore you again, use your platform without perpetuating any further abuse. I tell you, there are ways to do this mindfully. There are ways to talk about this topic, this very important topic, but doing it mindfully, respectfully, and by not bringing human lives or names into the conversation when they do not consent. This sort of thing can be resolved by law enforcement and in the court, legal systems. It can be reported, as I've said, to Child Protective Services or Adult Protective Services. Social media is not the place for these discussions. So, here are some of the things that we can do to stop the cycle of abuse. One, we can keep the names of real people who are victims of abuse out of our public discussions about abuse, especially children and vulnerable adults. Living or deceased, these people do not have a voice if you just randomly talk about them. Remember, these are real people with real lives and real families who can be affected by your words. And there are ways to talk about the general subject of abuse without having these names in our conversations. So that's one way that you can help stop the cycle of abuse from continuing in our world. Two, you can take a mindful approach about how you speak about people who are victims of abuse and perpetrators as well. Just be aware of your words and how your words might affect the lives of real people living or deceased and also their family members. Three, use sensitivity in the manner in which you discuss these things. Such an important topic as abuse does need to be approached with sensitivity. Use sensitivity in the manner with which you approach subjects like abuse. And think about the people and their real lives when you do discuss these things. As I said before, keeping people's names out of the discussion is probably your best bet. And if you do have their permission or if they're with you, please use sensitivity and compassion for them. It's really going to be beneficial for them and for your listeners if you do this. And please be mindful. We would want other people to do this toward us, right? This is the golden rule that I'm talking about here. Four, find out the truth before you start to speak. Truth being facts. There's no harm in gaining factual evidence and data and also putting your honest opinion out there. This is what makes our conversations wonderful and makes opinion and fact come together in a beautiful way. Nothing wrong with doing that at all, as long as it's done mindfully and respectfully with consideration and care for the subject matter that we're talking about. And five, we can talk about these issues mindfully, sensitively, truthfully, and respectfully without talking about specific people, places, or incidents, victims of abuse, and especially when we disagree about how these things can be handled. We can do all of this. We can talk and have these conversations, and we can be respectful to each other. I would love to see more of that in the future. It would be so much more entertaining than having people say this or say that and not have very much care to their words. Even those people who have care, in their words can say things in a way in which that it's really hurtful and harmful. So just be mindful. That's probably the real message that I want to bring across, is to be mindful in your conversations about these issues and keeping people's names out of the conversation. So in closing, I just want to say that we're not going to do this perfectly at first. All of the suggestions that I've given you, we're not going to do it perfectly. We are going to mess up. We're going to learn, though. We may not ever get it perfectly right. And yet, if we're committed to learning, we will improve our treatment of others and ourselves. And we can learn how to disagree with each other without abuse. I thank you so much for listening. I invite you to tune in next Monday, January 25th at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for a live stream that I'll be doing. We'll continue the discussion, not just about abuse, but ways to handle conflict with each other. So please join us. And I look forward to seeing you and hearing your voice. In the meantime, take good care.
Thank you for listening to Calming the Chaos. If the information in today's podcast was helpful, please consider subscribing and share it with your friends. You can find this podcast on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, and on YouTube. You can also go to my website at www.lokahicounseling.com for more resources for calming your mental and emotional chaos. This includes a CD I created that teaches you how to practice mindfulness in less than 10 minutes. So check it out. Thanks again for listening, and I look forward to sharing my next podcast episode with you. In the meantime, take care.